Thank you for the invitation. I'm happy to be here. And since my neck is already a bit stressed, I hope you don't mind if I stand here, and I want to show you a couple of pictures, and it's easier for me to switch back and forth if I can also see what you see. I will talk about the second largest subcamp of Flossenbürg, of the camp complex of Flossenbürg concentration camp, which was placed in Hersbruck, a place which you will see tomorrow. And I will start with a map. This map is taken from a book by a lawyer who was at that time based in Munich, Edward Kossoy, and it's the Handbuch des Entschädigungswesens, a compensation manual, which was published in 1957. It was aimed, or the audience for this book were former forced and slave laborers who applied for German compensation funding. And many of them, of course, were imprisoned in many camps, often for a very short period of time, which they couldn't remember the names of. And these maps, there are a couple of maps included in this book, were aimed to help them to really prove where they were kept and to find out the right names of the camps. As you can see, Central Europe, or the German Reich, was a country full of concentration camps. Not only the main camps like Mittelbau-Dora or Sachsenhausen, Ravensbrück, Flossenbürg, Dachau, but also each of these camps had a smaller or bigger range of sub-camps. Like in the case of Dachau, there were 140 sub-camps and work details, commandos that spread not only in Bavaria, but also in what is today Baden-Württemberg or Austria. And so the important effect of this map is to show you that the concentration camp system obviously is not a matter of 6 or 7 places. It's not a matter of Buchenwald and Auschwitz and Dachau, but it's also a matter of Hersbruck and Flöha and Mehlteuer and whatever names you have never heard of so far. In 1938, the SS ordered the construction of a concentration camp in Flossenbürg. The SS hoped to exploit the rich granite quarries in Flossenbürg in order to profit from giant and prestigious building projects as the Reich Party rally grounds here in Nuremberg. Concentration camp prisoners were considered as cheap labor for this purpose. Soon after the camp was established, inmates also had to work outside of the camp. Especially local farmers and small businesses ordered prisoners mostly for a short period of time, for example during the harvest, and prisoners were guarded on their way to work, and they were brought back to the main camp at night. This was of course a very ineffective, insufficient method where you needed a lot of guard personnel. And in the course of the war, this system was skipped completely, and the SS tried to lend concentration camp prisoners to private companies or to larger construction projects. In the course of time, a large system of sub-camps developed, and you can clearly see some regional hotspots, especially in southern Saxony and in northern Bohemia. This is very easy to explain. These were highly industrial regions, especially with a lot of consumer industries, textile industry, food production, etc. Many of these companies were not considered important for the war, for armament purposes, so they were shut down. And companies from cities like Berlin, where there were an increasing danger of air raids, were relocated to the rural areas and thus ended up in small towns and villages in this area. Hersbruck is based here, we are here. You see two spots here, which I will comment in a second. The concentration camp subcamps in recent research are usually divided up into three categories. First, there were subcamps for SS units or SS enterprises, like the SS barracks in Nuremberg, a place which is quite close to where we are right now. Most inmates in these camps were skilled workers like carpenters, welders, locksmiths, etc. And these camps were rather small, about 100 to 200 inmates, most of them Germans or German-speaking prisoners. They were skilled workers, which means they were valuable, which means they were treated relatively better than unskilled laborers in the main camp. The second category is subcamps for the armament industry. Hannes already mentioned this Serbian women who were brought from Ravensbrück concentration camp to Dresden, where they had to work in an ammunition factory. In Nuremberg there was also one subcamp, which Sanella mentioned earlier on in the report of Agnes Rosa, with 600 Jewish women who had to work for Siemens. These subcamps, in the case of Flossenbürg, came into existence by the end of 1943. There was a long struggle between the SS and the private companies and Minister Speer. On the other hand, the companies wanted to have an effective kind of forced labor and wanted to have the workers within their work grounds, within the places where the plants were located, of course. The SS wanted to keep control over these prisoners. So in the beginning, workers for the armaments industry were expected to work within the concentration camps. Part of a Messerschmitt plant was relocated to Flossenbürg. A part of a Heinkel aircraft plant was placed in Sachsenhausen. But later on, the private companies kind of won this struggle and were allowed to have separate divisions within their plants where they could use concentration camp inmates for forced labor, both men and women. And the third category of subcamps were large-scale construction sites which were established only in mid-1944, in the last year of the war, more or less. The Nazi regime wanted to protect the German armament industry from the increasingly successful Allied air raids, and therefore it planned the relocation of important production lines to subterranean production sites in tunnels or in huge bunkers. In these construction sites, the most grueling, the most terrible conditions were found. Prisoners were least likely to survive. This was a place where you needed mostly unskilled labor just for digging, shoveling, very heavy but not very not very skilled labor, and so every prisoner was replaceable at any time. The subcamp at Hersbruck was typical of the camps that were established during the final year of the war. Beginning in May 1944, a major construction site was established at the Hohbürg mountain. This is the little village of Happburg, which is close to Hersbruck, about 5 kilometers. And here you have the large construction site, and within this mountain, inmates were supposed to dig a huge tunnel system. Large German construction companies like Hochtief, the Siemens Bauunion, and AEG took part in the installation of an underground aircraft engine plant for BMW. The BMW aircraft plant from Munich Allach was supposed to be relocated to this tunnel system. The construction site with the code name B7 included railway lines, building yards, technical facilities, and tunnels. Hamburg, the village where the SS management was headquartered, was also transformed in the process. SS men, including employees and engineers from participating companies, were housed in town. Some buildings served as office space, and the first inmates were also housed in Hamburg. Of course, the project not only was limited to this mountain, but you needed all kinds of infrastructure. Plans called for a light railway to deliver supplies to the massive construction site at Hamburg. And under the direction of the building company Sager and Werner, about 400 prisoners worked laying railroad tracks between the little village of Pommelsbrunn and Hamburg. Sager and Werner, by the way, was also in a consortium with the Siemens Bauunion and Bohr. So these were all old buddies from other places. The ground was marshy, and the inmates were often forced to toil in water which was reaching up to their hips. So this labor detail had the highest mortality rate. And of course, if I show you this map, there's a little village up here, there's a village up here, there are villages all over the place. This means this was not a secret system. Of course, the public knew and learned about this. In July 1944, the SS established one of the largest subcamps of the Flossenbürg concentration camp system on the outskirts of Hersbruck. In August 1944, 1,900 inmates were imprisoned here. You see the camp area with the barracks. This is a former barrack of the Reichsarbeitsdienst, which was used as a Kommandantur. And you also see the public swimming pool, which was located right next to the camp. So it's that close. Prisoners were forced to march 5 kilometers every day to the construction site at Hamburg. In the evening, they had to march back again, of course. Up to 2,500 prisoners had to work in each shift. There were 2 shifts, and here you see the part of the tunnel system which is not accessible today. It's too dangerous. The geological formation is very shaky, and so you cannot enter these tunnels. But you can see some of the former entrances of the tunnel system. Of course, there were not enough SS men to guard the ever-growing number of prisoners. Therefore, Air Force soldiers and ethnic Germans, Volksdeutsche, from southeastern Europe were detailed as guards for the subcamp, not only in Hersbruck but in the entire camp complex. Besides that, some inmates were used by the SS to guard and control their fellow prisoners, as was the usual practice in the camp system. Camp and block elders were supposed to ensure order, while capos guarded labor detachments, worked in the sick bay, and distributed meals. Most prisoner functionaries at Hersbruck were Germans who wore the green triangle of the so-called criminals. As long-time concentration camp prisoners, they possessed great influence and privileges that they exploited to their own advantage. And there, especially for Hersbruck, are a lot of reports about the cruelty of some of these capos. The barracks soon became overcrowded. Arrangements to feed and shelter the prisoners were totally improvised. Living conditions were catastrophic right from the start. Malnutrition, contagious disease, cold, contaminated water, and mud led to a massive increase in the death rate. For the SS, this high mortality rate was an acceptable side effect. As I said, workers were replaceable. At first, the dead were cremated at Nuremberg, at the crematorium. Later, the rapid increase in the number of the dead became a really pressing concern, and in late 1944, the SS ordered the burning of bodies outdoors in the forests near 2 little villages in the area, Schupf and Hupmersberg. In the fall of 1944, the SS ordered the construction of an entirely new camp between Hamburg and Fürnbach. The original plan was to transfer all Habsburg prisoners to this new camp, but this plan was not carried out within the course of the war. However, in January 1945, a crematorium went into operation in this new camp, but it too did not have sufficient capacity. Bodies of the dead continued to be burned outside these little villages. And of course, the smoke was visible for kilometers, and people in the area at least knew roughly what was going on there. Given these circumstances, it is no surprise that some of the prisoners tried to escape these terrible conditions. We know of at least 50 prisoners who tried to escape between May 44 and April 45. Escape attempts were extremely risky, and recaptured prisoners were often executed. So successful escapes were very, very rare. In November 1944, a very special group of prisoners entered the Habsburg subcamp. On November 9th of 1944, according to the Flossenbürg prisoner number books, as Hannes showed us, more than 2,400 inmates arrived in Flossenbürg, mostly Hungarian Jews. They had started out in Bor, where the copper mines were dissolved in the fall of 1944, and while hundreds of other prisoners were killed, either in the vicinity of Bor or on the death marches, these 2,400 men finally arrived in Flossenbürg. And I also have a page from the number books where I have highlighted one entry of Bernhard Teitelbaum, who I will talk about a little later. Besides the prisoners, also the machinery that was used in Bor was distributed and relocated to other camps. I found a source by the Organisation Todt Südost, which defined where to transport machinery, valuable machinery from Bor. And this document shows a couple of addresses. The rail station at Amstetten in Austria, which is close to the Mauthausen camp system, rail station in Halle an der Saale, which is close to Mittelbau-Dora, and the railway station in Habsburg, which is this one. Within a very short period of time, these 2,400 prisoners were distributed to other camps. They did not stay in Flossenbürg, but they were distributed mainly to camps where there were large construction sites. As I said, Mittelbau-Dora, Buchenwald, and a couple of hundred of them ended up in Habsburg. One of these people was Bernhard Teitelbaum. Anti-Semitic persecution had forced him, he was from Hungary, and persecution had forced him to abandon his university studies in 1941, after which he was drafted into compulsory labor service. In July 1943, he was deported to the Bor copper mine in Serbia, where he labored in tunnel construction and in the demolition squad. After the camp was dissolved, he barely survived the transport to Flossenbürg and finally ended up in Habsburg. In his memoirs, which he published in 2001 under the title "Though I Walk Through the Valley of the Shadow of Death," he was a very pious Jew, and of course this is a quote from Psalm 23. Teitelbaum describes how he was recruited for a certain commando. Quote, "The head of the work detail said to me, 'You were in the Bor detachment?' I replied, 'Yes,' so I was assigned to dig tunnels." So in a certain sense, these were, although it was unskilled labor, these were experts in unskilled labor, so they were detailed assigned to this work detail. And we also have many reports from prisoners who had to work for Siemens Bauunion in Bor, and then had to work for Siemens Bauunion again in Habsburg. So obviously the companies kept an eye on who was a good laborer. Teitelbaum was forced to work building tunnels at Habsburg until he fell ill with typhus in the spring of 1945. This is a plan of the huge tunnel system in Hersbruck, the plans were gigantic, 200,000 square meters, and of course, like all the gigantic plans of the Nazis, it never worked out. And the different colors show in which state the already finished parts of the system were, and you see the colored parts are much less than the entire system. These are the tunnels that were like really built out, as I showed you in the picture before. Although BMW had given up this project of an underground factory already by the end of 1944, the SS, who was in charge of this construction site, just kept on working. They didn't know what they were digging for, but they just kept on going. However, by the end of the war, out of 200,000 square meters, 14,000 were finished. That's a length of 4 kilometers of tunnels. In February 1945, a huge evacuation transport from the Groß-Rosen concentration camp arrived at Hersbruck. More than 6,000 inmates were crowded into the barracks. You saw the aerial picture. Hersbruck at that time had about, I think, 8,000 or 9,000 inhabitants, of course in a much larger area, and more than almost 7,000 prisoners were cramped into these few barracks. By the time the camp was dissolved in April 1945, the SS had held about 9,000 people from more than 20 countries captive at Hersbruck. About 4,000 prisoners died at Hersbruck within 10 months as a result of the catastrophic living and work conditions. Most inmates were from Eastern Europe. The largest national groups were Poles, 2,500 Poles, 430 of them Jewish, and more than 1,400 Hungarians, 800 of them Jewish. Of course, Hungarians in terms of Hungary at the time, which includes parts of Croatia, Slovakia, etc., etc. In spring 1945, the SS evacuated all or most concentration camps. The approaching Allied forces should find no witnesses of the atrocities that were committed in the camps. On April 7th, a train with 1,600 sick inmates left Hersbruck with the destination of Dachau, and Bernhard Teitelbaum was one of them. He arrived at Dachau, he had to go on another death march and was finally liberated somewhere near the Alps, almost in Austria. And later he emigrated to Israel and lived till a couple of years ago. Between April 8th and 13th, almost 4,000 prisoners were marched southwards towards Dachau in 5 large columns. And during the death march, about 500 were able to escape, about 300 died. And one of the deceased was Gavrilo Kaplarski, who was a trained journalist. He had studied journalism in Paris, had come back to his Serbian hometown. And he was a friend of Ljubiša Letic, who we'll hear about soon, and died on the death march in a little village of Schmidmühl. Other prisoners were liberated by American troops, and on April 23rd, about 2,000 of them reached Dachau. After the end of the war, the former camp was immediately pragmatically used for other purposes. Members of the SS were interned in the former campgrounds. Later, a refugee camp was established there. In the beginning of the 1950s, the town of Hersbruck had the barracks torn down. A housing estate was built there on the site on purpose in order to get rid of the traces of this sub-camps. It took many years, in fact decades, for the history of the former sub-camp to be rediscovered, but that's the topic of the next contribution. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much. Now for our last speaker, Thomas Wrench.
How do I get out of here? Oh, and excuse me, may I add this shortly? Since I don't know whether you will see this tomorrow. There are actually two places of the installation that we made a couple of years ago, the Flossenbürg Memorial Site and the Bavarian Memorial Foundation. And you will definitely see the one at Hersbruck, but there's also another one at Hamburg, close to the site where the prisoners actually had to work. And I don't have a special picture of this, but here is a drilling device, a Bohrhammer in German. I don't know the English word for it. And this is one of the machines that Ljubiša Letic had to work with. And if you were there, you could start an audio segment where he describes how he had to work there. Okay, that's it. Thank you.